Today, we're diving into a really searing and, for a lot of people, a pretty uncomfortable political critique. We're going to try and peel back the layers of what one analyst calls the great American political spectacle, to look past the day-to-day noise and get at the real mechanics of power. At the very heart of this analysis is this one powerful idea, that our mainstream politics is just a show, a repetitive one. This quote right here really sets the stage for a way of thinking that sees all the usual conflicts not as real struggles, but as a performance. Something designed to keep us all distracted. So who's behind this critique? Well, the framework we're about to explore comes from Alfred Cromwell. He's the analyst and the voice you'll find on the YouTube channel citytutoringmath. And his critique offers a really provocative and often counterintuitive view of how both foreign and domestic policy actually work. Okay, let's get into it. All right, first up, we're going right to the core of Cromwell's whole argument, this idea of politics as a grand theater. This is where he says the real action, the stuff that really matters, isn't happening on the stage that we're all busy watching. According to Cromwell, those familiar labels we all use, left and right, they've become pretty much meaningless. He argues they don't do anything to explain what he sees as the real logic of how we're governed, which he calls a predatory system that acts kind of like a corporate raid, no matter who's supposedly in charge. The real power, in his view, is working behind the scenes of this whole show. So next, let's see how this framework applies to foreign policy. Cromwell uses the exact same lens to look at America's actions around the world. He uses the situation in Venezuela as a perfect case study for how what he calls the imperial machine really operates. And this leads to a really crucial question, one that Cromwell tackles head-on. If this system is so obviously predatory, in his view, how does it manage to neutralize its own opposition? How does it even manage to get critics, especially from the left, on its side? To answer that, Cromwell brings in this key concept he calls moral hygiene. Here's the idea. He argues that when critics of American foreign policy make a big show of denouncing a foreign leader like Maduro before they critique U.S. actions, they're not actually opposing anything. He sees it as just a ritual, a performance they do to prove they're one of the good guys, a performance that he claims end up just greasing the wheels for the empire's machine. This quote from Cromwell really gets to what he sees as the empire's one core demand. He's arguing that it's pretty explicit. Whether a country is democratic or humane is totally irrelevant. In his view, the only thing that actually matters is obedience, that they accept their subordinate role in what he very controversially calls the Zionist imperial household. So where does Donald Trump fit into all this? Well, Cromwell draws this really provocative contrast. He suggests that while past presidents would cover up their intentions with rhetorical perfume and diplomatic theater, Trump just came out with the brutal, rapacious honesty of a shark. The goal was the same, seize resources, but the open frankness about it was something new. Cromwell says this all just follows a well-worn script, one he calls the Kissinger playbook. And it's a simple two-step process. First, you get rid of the obstruction, any leader who won't play ball. Second, you install what he calls a synthetic opposition, a new face who looks like change, but is really just a totally pliant servant to the empire's interests. Okay, let's pivot now, because Cromwell argues this whole imperial logic isn't just for export. He sees the exact same patterns, the same machinery being turned inward, being applied right here within America's own borders. And he says it's leading to the rise of a domestic police state. And to explain this, he uses another key term, moral inversion. He points to what he sees as this just grotesque symmetry, where people who say they distrust big government and love individual liberty suddenly become the biggest cheerleaders for what he calls the theatrical brutality and unchecked power of federal law enforcement. And this quote just captures the biting, sharp nature of his critique. He's describing the job of the state not as governing, but as persuasion. It's about convincing the public that trampling all over due process is actually patriotic and that the federal agents doing it are heroes. And then Cromwell makes his most controversial claim about where this domestic strategy comes from. He asserts that this whole setup isn't homegrown. He says it has the unmistakable stamp of external orchestration. And he specifically points to what he calls a curious foreign address for Homeland Security in Tel Aviv. So this brings us back around to the figure of Donald Trump. If he's not some kind of master strategist pulling the strings, then what exactly is his role in this whole theater? Well, Cromwell's assessment is, let's just say, it's deeply unflattering. He sees him not as a leader, but as a symptom of a much deeper decay. Yeah, Cromwell's description of Trump is direct and it's brutal. He basically paints him as a court jester pretending to be an emperor, someone who has all the appetites of a despot, but none of the actual intellect or cunning to pull it off. In this view, Trump's real job was just to be the face of the nation's slow, steady unraveling. So, after all that, where does this leave the American Republic? According to this analysis, what's the final forecast? As you can probably guess by now, the outlook is pretty grim. The conclusion of this whole critique is incredibly stark. Cromwell doesn't see any path back. There's no restoration coming. Instead, he predicts a future that's just defined by a steady normalization of chaos. All the political turmoil we see, he's saying that's not just a phase, it's the new normal. And to really hammer this point home, he uses that incredibly powerful metaphor of the Titanic. All the political fights that get so much attention, in his view, that's nothing more than passengers fighting over deck chairs. Meanwhile, the ship of state itself is sinking, and nobody's paying attention to the real crisis. And we're going to end with the haunting question that Cromwell leaves us with. It's this final provocative thought about what loyalty and betrayal even mean anymore. If the biggest threats to the Republic don't show up in a uniform, but instead show up with a friendly, reassuring smile, how are we supposed to even recognize them?